The stagecoach out of Millhaven smelled like wet leather and old tobacco, and Elena Hart sat pressed against the far corner of it, with her carpetbag balanced across her knees, trying to take up as little space as possible. It was a habit she'd developed young and never managed to break. There were four other passengers: a heavyset merchant who'd fallen asleep before the wheels even cleared the depot, two sisters traveling to meet family somewhere near the Callow River, who spoke to each other in low, conspiratorial tones, and glanced at Elena occasionally the way people glance at weather they don't quite trust, and a retired army officer with a gray mustache who smoked a pipe and stared out the window with the focused intensity of a man trying very hard not to engage with anyone. None of them asked her name. None of them asked where she was going. That suited Elena fine. She wasn't entirely sure she had an answer to either question. Millhaven was 3 days behind her now. 3 days since they'd lowered Douglas Hart into the ground on a gray Tuesday morning with the whole town watching and nobody once thinking to stand beside his widow. 3 days since Margaret Hart, Douglas's mother, had taken Elena by the elbow after the service with a grip that left marks and walked her around to the back of the house, away from the other mourners, and said what she'd clearly been holding in her teeth for years. "You were never what he needed," Margaret had said. Not loudly. Margaret never raised her voice. She didn't have to. "And now that he's gone, there's no reason for you to be here. I think you know that." Elena had known better than to argue. She'd been arguing with that woman inside her own head for 6 years and had never once won. She'd packed what fit in the carpet bag: a change of clothes, Douglas's old pocket watch because it was the only thing of his she'd ever actually loved, a small amount of money she'd been saving in the lining of her winter coat for reasons she couldn't have fully explained even to herself. And she'd walked out of Millhaven before noon. The westbound stage had been leaving at 2. She'd bought the cheapest ticket available. That was how Elena Hart, 28 years old, newly widowed, and entirely unwanted, came to be sitting in a stagecoach headed toward a part of the country she'd never seen, listening to the wheels eat up the miles and trying not to count how much money she had left. She slept somewhere around dusk, her head tipped against the window frame, and woke to the sound of something going very wrong underneath the coach. A grinding crack. The whole vehicle lurched hard to the right. One of the sisters screamed. The merchant grabbed the overhead strap and swore impressively. Elena grabbed her carpetbag and braced her feet against the opposite seat, and then the coach tilted at an angle that was not compatible with continuing forward, and they stopped. The driver's voice came through from above, tight with frustration. "Axle's gone. Everybody out." Outside, the light had gone the deep amber of late afternoon. They were on a stretch of road Elena didn't recognize, which was not particularly helpful since she didn't recognize any of the roads out here. There was flat scrubland on both sides, some low hills to the north, and about a quarter-mile ahead, a scatter of buildings that constituted, apparently, a town. "What town is that?" she asked the driver, who was crouching in the dirt examining the damage with the expression of a man who'd seen this before and hadn't liked it then either. "Harlan's Crossing," he said without looking up. "Is there a place to stay?" "One hotel." He glanced up at her then briefly. "Might be full." Elena picked up her carpetbag and started walking. Harlan's Crossing was not much. A main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other without incident. A general store, a blacksmith with a hand-painted sign, a saloon that appeared to be doing the most business in town at this particular hour. The hotel the driver had mentioned was a 2-story frame building with a porch that needed repainting and a lobby that smelled like boiled cabbage. The woman behind the front desk had gray hair pulled into a tight knot and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "Room for 1, Elena said. The woman looked at her, at the carpetbag, at her dress, which was clean but plainly cut and clearly not new. $1.50 a night, breakfast included. Elena did the math in her head and didn't like the result, but she paid for 2 nights and took the key. The room was small. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out over the alley behind the building, and Elena sat on the edge of the mattress and didn't move for a while. Just sat there with her hands in her lap and the carpetbag at her feet, listening to the sounds of a town she didn't know going about its evening business below her. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next. She had enough money for maybe 3 more weeks if she was careful. She had no family who'd take her in. She had skills that were more domestic than marketable. She could cook, keep a house, manage a household ledger, sew well enough. In Millhaven, those things had been invisible. She suspected they might be invisible here too. She pulled out Douglas's pocket watch and looked at it. 7:42. The watch had been his grandfather's, and Douglas had kept it wound out of obligation rather than affection. Elena had wound it out of something she hadn't been able to name until now. It was the only piece of her married life she hadn't been glad to leave behind. She was still looking at it when her stomach made itself known with some urgency, reminding her she hadn't eaten since breakfast. The saloon was not an option she seriously considered. There was a small restaurant 2 doors down from the hotel, Mabel's Kitchen, painted in uneven letters above the door, and through the window she could see half a dozen tables, most of them occupied. She went in. The woman who she guessed was Mabel was broad-shouldered and efficient and pointed her to a table near the window without ceremony. Elena ordered the cheapest thing on the handwritten menu, which turned out to be beef stew with cornbread, and sat watching the door open and close as other customers came and went. She was almost done eating when the door opened and 2 boys came in, followed by a man. The boys were maybe 8 and 11, she guessed, the older one with a serious, watchful face, the younger one scanning the room with open curiosity before his gaze landed on the nearly empty jar of hard candy sitting on the counter near the register and didn't move again. They were dressed for work, both of them, with the particular combination of dust and tiredness that came from spending a full day outdoors doing things that actually needed doing. The man behind them was tall, not in any dramatic way, but in the practical sense of someone who'd grown into his height and gotten used to it. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had been introduced to a razor recently, but not within the last day or two. His coat was good quality, but worn at the elbows. He moved like someone who was used to being responsible for things. Not commanding exactly, but deliberate. He scanned the restaurant the way you do when you've come in expecting a table and aren't certain there'll be one. And his eyes passed over Elena the same way they passed over the other occupied tables. Just an accounting of the room. Mabel appeared and pointed them toward the table next to Elena's. The younger boy sat down first, then immediately slid sideways so he could continue monitoring the candy jar. The older one sat across from him, pulled out a small folded piece of paper and a stub of pencil, and appeared to begin working on something. The man settled into the third chair with the slight heaviness of someone who'd been on his feet since before the sun was properly up. "Pa," the younger boy said, "can I have one of those?" "We talked about this, Cal. We talked about it before dinner. Dinner's almost over." "Dinner hasn't started yet." "It's about to start." The man looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite exhaustion, but somewhere in the territory between them. "Ask me again when you've eaten your vegetables. I'll eat them faster if I have something to look forward to." "That's not how it works." "It could be how it works." Elena realized she was listening with more attention than was polite, and looked back down at her stew. But she could still hear them, and she wasn't trying very hard not to. "What'd you get done today?" the man asked, directing the question at the older boy. The older boy didn't look up from his paper. "Fix the fence on the north side. Water trough needs a new board on the west end, I wrote it down. And the gray mare's limping on her left front." "I saw that. I'll check her after supper." "I think it's the shoe." "Probably is." A pause. "Good work today, Eli." The older boy, Eli, didn't respond, but something around his jaw eased slightly. Mabel came and took their order, and the conversation shifted to logistics Elena had no context for, and she finished her stew and signaled for the check. When she stood to leave, the younger boy, Cal, the father had called him, looked up at her with the direct, uncomplicated curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is impolite. "Did you come on the stagecoach?" he asked. "Cal," the man said, a warning note. "I'm just asking." Elena paused. "Yes," she said. "The axle broke." Cal considered this with great seriousness. "That happens a lot on this road. Pa says the ruts are too deep." "Cal." "What?" "It's true." Elena found herself almost smiling. "It is true," she said. "Good evening." She was at the door when the man spoke, not loudly, more like something he said because it was the natural next thing to say, rather than something he'd planned. "There's a good boarding house on Clement Street if the hotel's too dear. Mrs. Aldrich. She's fair." Elena turned. He was looking at her with a directness that wasn't unfriendly, just straightforward in the way of someone who said what they meant without decoration. Thank you, she said. She went back to the hotel. She didn't sleep well. The mattress was soft in the wrong places, and the night sounds of Harlan's Crossing were unfamiliar, and her mind kept cycling through the same territory it had been cycling through for 3 days. What she'd left behind, what she had, what she was going to do with it. She'd been married at 22 to Douglas Hart, who had not been cruel but had not been particularly kind either, which she'd come to understand was its own category of difficult. He'd needed someone to run his household, and she'd needed somewhere to land, and they'd arrived at a mutual understanding that stopped well short of affection. His family had tolerated her the way they tolerated most inconveniences, with barely concealed impatience and the abiding hope that she would eventually go away. After 6 years she had gone away, though not in the manner she'd planned. The question now was what happened after. She could go to Denver, she supposed. She had a vague idea that there were more opportunities for women in larger cities, factories, laundry operations, domestic work, the work she'd done for Douglas's household but paid, this time, or at least nominally compensated. She could make it stretch if she was careful. She'd always been careful. But Denver felt enormous and abstract in the dark, and Harlan's Crossing was right outside the window, real and small and specific, and she was very tired. She finally fell asleep sometime after midnight and dreamed about nothing she remembered in the morning. The second day in Harlan's Crossing, Elena went looking for work. She was realistic about this. She'd spent enough of her life being unrealistic and had the results to show for it. She wasn't pretty enough to wait tables at the kind of establishment that hired for looks. She wasn't trained for anything that required training. She could read and write and do arithmetic, which put her ahead of some people, but not in any way that was immediately profitable. She went to the general store first because it seemed the most plausible starting point and spoke to the proprietor, a bespectacled man named Orrin Fitch, who listened politely and told her he wasn't hiring. She tried the hotel, where the gray-haired woman listened less politely and told her the same thing. She found a small dress shop and a small apothecary and a freight office, and was told no in 3 different registers, apologetic, indifferent, and faintly annoyed respectively. By mid-afternoon, she was sitting on the bench outside the general store with her carpet bag beside her, and the particular feeling in her chest that she recognized as the thing she felt when she'd run out of sensible options and was trying to locate the sensible ones that must still be there if she looked correctly. "You're still here." She looked up. It was the man from the restaurant, the tall one with the worn elbows. He was carrying a sack of something from the store and looked mildly surprised to see her. "The next coach doesn't come until Thursday," she said. "That's right." He set the sack down and looked at her with that same direct, undecorated attention. "Boone," he said. "Wyatt Boone." "Elena Hart." He nodded. "You find a room?" "At the hotel. Aldrich would be cheaper." "I know, I may move." He picked up the sack. He didn't leave immediately, which she noticed. He seemed to be doing a calculation of some kind, and she waited while he did it. "You looking for work?" he said. She didn't bother pretending otherwise. "Yes." "What kind?" "Whatever's available." He looked at her for a moment. "Fitch hire you?" "No." "Morrison?" He must have meant the hotel. "No." He shifted the sack. "My ranch is about 6 miles out. Place called Boone Creek. I've got 2 boys and no one managing the house. It's not glamorous work." Elena held his gaze. "I didn't come out here looking for glamour. It pays $30 a month and room and board. Mostly it's cooking, keeping things in order, helping with accounts when I need it. Boys aren't difficult." He paused. "The younger one talks a lot." I noticed. Something shifted in his face, not quite amusement. "You'd need to start soon. I'm short-handled." "How soon?" "Tomorrow." She thought about the money in her coat lining. She thought about Denver, large and abstract. She thought about 3 more nights at the hotel and then running out of thread. "All right," she said. He nodded once, like that settled it. "Be at the south end of Main Street at 6. I'll have the wagon." He walked away and Elena sat there for a moment longer. The sun was getting low and the air had turned cool, and she had just agreed to go to work for a man she'd spoken to twice, in a town she hadn't planned to stop in, 6 miles further into a frontier she didn't know. She told herself it was practical. It was the most practical available option. She went back to the hotel and asked the woman at the desk about checking out in the morning. The wagon was there at 6, and so were the boys. Cal half asleep and listing sideways on the seat. Eli sitting straight with the posture of someone who considered slumping a moral failing. Wyatt was loading the last of his supplies into the back. He handed her up without ceremony, and they pulled out of Harlan's Crossing as the sun was just edging over the eastern hills. Cal woke up enough to ask her 3 questions in the first 10 minutes. What her name was, where she came from, and whether she knew how to make biscuits. She answered all 3. He informed her with great seriousness that the woman who'd worked for them before burned everything. "Cal," Eli said, "it's not mean, it's true. She burned the biscuits and the beans, and once she burned the coffee. You can't burn coffee." "She did. She didn't burn the coffee, she let it boil too long and it went bitter." "Same thing." Elena watched this exchange with the peripheral part of her attention that she'd developed for monitoring household dynamics, the part that logged who deferred to whom and where the real tensions lived. Eli was protective of the adults around him in the careful way of a child who'd had to be. Cal hadn't quite got there yet. Wyatt drove with his attention on the road, but he was listening. She could tell by the slight tilt of his head. "I haven't burned coffee yet," Elena said. "I'll let you know if that changes." Cal considered her with one eye. "Do you burn biscuits?" "Not on purpose." He seemed to accept this as satisfactory and turned to watch the landscape go by. Boone Creek Ranch appeared after a long stretch of open land. A proper spread, bigger than she'd expected, with a solid farmhouse and several outbuildings and a fenced pasture where a handful of horses stood in the morning light. The house had been well built at some point and was showing its age now in the way things do when there's too much to maintain and not enough time to maintain it. The porch railing was loose. The garden beds on the south side were overgrown with a season's worth of neglect. She took that in the way she took everything in, quietly, without comment. The inside of the house told a similar story. Clean enough, but with the particular kind of order that comes from necessity rather than care. Dishes stacked practically rather than arranged. A layer of dust on the higher surfaces. A kitchen that had clearly been managed by someone who cooked to fuel people rather than to feed them. "There's a room off the kitchen," Wyatt said. "Belongs to you." It was small, smaller than the hotel room, but it had a window facing east, which meant morning light and a hook on the door and her own 4 walls. "It's fine," she said. He showed her where things were, the supplies. The ledger he kept in the desk in the front room, the schedule he operated by, which he explained with the efficiency of someone who'd been managing alone long enough that explaining things felt slightly foreign. She listened and asked 2 questions and noted 3 things she'd need to address in the first week. When he was done, he picked up his hat from the table and looked at her with that steady directness. "I appreciate you coming out," he said. "I know it's not what you planned." "I didn't have much of a plan," she said honestly. He nodded like that made sense to him and went out to the barn. Elena stood in the kitchen of Boone Creek Ranch and listened to the house settle around her. It was not quiet. There were ranch sounds. The distant sound of the boys somewhere outside. The creak of the building in the morning breeze. It was the kind of noise that had texture to it, different from the silence of Douglas's house, which had always felt more like an instruction than an absence. She found an apron. She found the flour. She started with the biscuits. The first week was hard in the way any new beginning is hard. The learning where everything lives, the figuring out of patterns, the daily negotiation of a space that belongs to someone else. Eli watched her with careful, assessing eyes that she recognized as the look of a child who'd been disappointed before and had made adjustments accordingly. He wasn't unfriendly. He was waiting. She understood waiting, so she didn't try to rush him. She cooked the meals and kept the ledger current when Wyatt set it out for her and gave Eli room to decide things on his own timeline. Cal had no such patience with his own reservations. By the 3rd day, he was following her around the kitchen with the cheerful persistence of a small dog that has decided you are interesting, asking her things. "Did you ever live on a ranch before?" "No." "Did you have kids?" "No." "Were you married before?" "Cal," Eli said from the table without looking up. "What?" "You can't ask people things like that." "Why not? It's just asking." "Because it's personal. Cal considered this limitation with visible dissatisfaction. He looked at Elena. Sorry, he said, not entirely convincingly. It's all right, Elena said. Yes, I was married before. What happened to your husband? He died. Cal absorbed this with the straightforward gravity of a child who hasn't yet learned to treat death as unspeakable. That's sad, he said. Yes, she agreed. It was. Did you love him a lot? Eli made a sound that was not quite a word. Cal, Elena said gently, some things I'll tell you when I know you better. He thought about it. Fair, he said, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She caught Eli watching her after that. Not hostile, just evaluating. Sit. On the 8th day, Wyatt came into the kitchen in the evening, looking like he'd spent the day fighting something he hadn't won. He sat down at the table and she poured him coffee without asking because it had become apparent that he drank coffee in the evenings the way some men drank whiskey. Not for the pleasure of it, but for the structure. Voss's man came by today, he said. She'd heard the name once, in passing, Garrett Voss, who owned the largest spread in the county and appeared to have opinions about other people's land. What did he want? Same thing Voss always wants. Wyatt turned the coffee cup in his hands. Offered me 40 cents on the dollar for the place. Delivered it like he was doing me a favor. What did you say? What I always say. He looked up at her. This land's been Boone land for 22 years. My father built that barn with his own hands. Voss can want it all he likes. Elena sat down across from him. This was a thing she'd started doing. Not asking permission, just sitting. Wyatt didn't seem to mind. He'll keep pushing? She asked. He always keeps pushing. He set down the cup. He's been pushing for 3 years since my wife died. I think he figured I'd fold without her. She was the one kept the books straight and the neighbors on our side. Something crossed his face that he put away quickly. I've been managing. I can see that, Elena said. He looked at her. The books you've been keeping. You saw the gap in the South Pasture lease? In March, yes, the tenant's underpaying by about $15. I know. I've been meaning to address it. I can write the letter if you'd like. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Cal arguing with the dog about something. You didn't come out here for accounting work, Wyatt said. I came out here for whatever needed doing, Elena said. The ledger needed doing. He looked at her steadily, and she looked back without looking away, which was a thing she'd practiced because it hadn't come naturally. All right, he said, write the letter. She did that evening and left it on the desk for him to review. He signed it in the morning without changing a word. It wasn't much. It wasn't nothing. Outside, the ranch went about its business. The gray mare's shoe got replaced. The fence on the north side held. Cal learned, eventually, to eat his vegetables before asking about candy, though it remained a negotiation every single time. And Garrett Voss, 6 miles away in his big house, was watching Boone Creek with the patient attention of a man who had not yet decided which angle of approach would work best. He was still watching. Elena didn't know that yet, but she had been a woman underestimated her entire life, and she was starting, quietly, to take stock of exactly what she had and what she could do with it. Which, as it turned out, was more than anyone had guessed. The letter to the South Pasture tenant went out on a Tuesday, and by Friday afternoon a man named Cleet Purvis showed up at the ranch house with his hat in his hands and the missing $15 in an envelope, looking like he wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or angry and had settled somewhere uncomfortably between the two. Wyatt was out mending the fence line on the eastern edge of the property, so it was Elena who answered the door. Purvis looked at her the way men in this part of the country often looked at her, like he was trying to figure out what category she fell into and wasn't finding a slot that fit. She wasn't a wife, wasn't a daughter, wasn't old enough to be a widowed aunt. She was just a woman standing in the doorway of Boone's house, and that was confusing to him. I'm looking for Wyatt Boone, he said. He's not in. I can take that if it's about the lease. Purvis looked at the envelope in his hand, looked at her. You the one that sent the letter? I wrote it, yes. He handed it over with the slight stiffness of a man whose pride has taken a small hit. There's a shortfall in April, too, he said. $3. I'll make it right next month. I'll note that, Elena said. She closed the door, put the envelope on the desk, and went back to the kitchen where a pot of beans had been threatening to boil over for the last 10 minutes. When Wyatt came in that evening and found the envelope on the desk, he picked it up without comment. He looked at it, then at her, then back at it. Purvis came himself? He did. Wyatt set it down. Something in his face that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. He hasn't responded to anything I've sent in 2 years. The tone was different this time, Elena said simply. Wyatt didn't ask what tone. He sat down at the table and she poured the coffee, and he drank half of it before he said, "There's an April shortfall. $3. He said next month. Wyatt nodded slowly. He had a way of processing information that she'd come to recognize, absorbing it, turning it over, fitting it into whatever architecture he maintained in his head for keeping the ranch alive. He didn't respond quickly to most things. It had unsettled her at first, that deliberateness. Douglas had been the same way, but his slowness had always felt like indifference. Wyatt's felt more like someone who'd been burned before by acting without thinking and had decided it wasn't worth the cost. "I'll need to ride into Harlan's Crossing tomorrow," he said. "There's a meeting with the land office." Elena said nothing, because she hadn't been invited into that information yet. "Voss has filed a competing claim on 40 acres of my east pasture," Wyatt said. "Says the original survey was wrong. It wasn't wrong. I had it resurveyed 2 years ago." He turned the coffee cup. "He's been working this angle for a while, trying different approaches. The law's on my side, but the land office out here it's complicated." "Complicated how?" He looked at her directly. "Deputy Land Commissioner is a man named Fenwick. He and Voss have a working relationship that isn't exactly official, but isn't exactly not." Elena absorbed that. "You have documentation of the survey?" "In the desk, second drawer." "Have you had an attorney review it?" "Can't afford one, not right now." She thought about that. "I can look at it tonight if you don't mind. I kept the household accounts for 6 years. I'm not an attorney, but I can read a document." Wyatt studied her for a moment with that steadiness that she'd stopped finding unnerving and started finding, if she was honest, oddly grounding. "All right," he said. She read the survey documents that night after the boys were in bed, at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up. They were not simple documents, but they were not impenetrable either, and by the time she went to sleep she had 3 pages of notes in her small, precise handwriting. The dates, the discrepancies in Voss's counterclaim, the specific language that undermined his argument. She left the notes on the desk and went to bed. In the morning they were gone. She didn't ask. 2 days later, Wyatt came back from Harlan's Crossing looking less like a man who'd lost something and more like a man who'd held his ground. And he told her, while washing up at the kitchen pump, that Fenwick had backed down on the claim for the time being. "For the time being," she said. "Yeah." He dried his hands. "Voss doesn't give up. He just recalculates." The autumn settled in around Boone Creek with the particular efficiency of the high country. Cold nights arriving earlier than expected, the light going golden and then thin, the days shortening in a way that made every hour of work more urgent. Elena learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she'd learned most things in her life, by watching carefully and making adjustments, and not making a noise about the adjustments she was making. She learned that Eli liked his eggs cooked through, no soft centers, and that he would eat almost anything if it wasn't talked about too much. She learned that Cal required about 15 minutes of being completely ignored in the morning before he was ready to be a person, and that if you violated this window of quiet, you would spend the rest of the morning untangling the results. She learned that Wyatt took coffee in the evening, but not always in the morning, that he read in the hour before bed if the day had been manageable, and that on the days it hadn't been, he sat on the porch in the dark for a while before coming in. She didn't say anything about the porch sitting. It wasn't her business. But she started leaving a lamp on in the kitchen on the bad evenings, so when he came in, there'd be light. Eli noticed that. He didn't say anything about it either, but he noticed. The shift with Eli happened on a Wednesday, the 3rd week of October, and it happened because of a horse. The gray mare that had been limping on her left front when Elena arrived had recovered from the shoe replacement and gone back to work. But Eli had developed an attachment to her in the meantime. The way you do with an animal that's been impaired, that vulnerability creating connection. He'd named her Agnes, which Cal considered a terrible name for a horse and said so repeatedly, and he spent his afternoons in the barn with her in the way that children who are sorting out internal things often go to animals. Elena had gone out to the barn to get a tool she'd left there, and she'd found Eli sitting in the straw next to Agnes with his knees pulled up, not doing anything. Just sitting. It was the posture of a person who needed to be somewhere that wasn't inside the house, and she recognized it because she'd spent most of her childhood with that same need. She got the tool. She was almost out the door when she turned back. "She's got a good temperament," Elena said. "Agnes." Eli looked up. "She doesn't spook easy." "That's worth a lot in a horse." He considered this. "My mother liked horses," he said, in the flat tone of a fact that's been handled so many times it's gone smooth. Elena didn't do anything dramatic with that. She didn't move closer or make her voice softer in the way adults do when they're trying to signal that they're being understanding. She just stood where she was and said, "What kind?" "Quarter horses, mostly. She had a paint when she was young. Pa has a picture of her with it somewhere." "What was her name? Your mother?" "Clara." He looked at Agnes. "She died when Cal was 3. Cal doesn't really remember her." "Do you?" "Some things." He didn't say what things. Elena nodded and went back to the house with the tool and didn't make anything of the conversation. And the next day, Eli came in from the barn and ate his dinner without the evaluating watchfulness and asked her if she thought cornbread needed sugar in it or not, which was the beginning of the longest argument the two of them would sustain for the next 6 months. She held the pro-sugar position. He held firmly against it. They never resolved it. That was, she came to understand, not the point. It was the first week of November when Wyatt came home from town with a look on his face that she'd started learning to read. The one that meant something had happened that he was still deciding how much of to say. She waited until the boys were in bed. "Voss made an offer on the Calloway place," Wyatt said, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee cooling in front of him. "Tom Calloway's been holding out for 3 years. He's sold." "That's his right," Elena said carefully. "Yes, it's his right." Wyatt turned the cup. "The Calloway place shares my western fence line for about 2 miles. It also sits between me and the water rights on Redtail Creek. I've had an informal agreement with Tom for 10 years about access." Elena understood the implication without him spelling it out. "Voss won't honor the agreement. Voss will do whatever lets him put the most pressure on my operation in the shortest time." He sat back. "If he blocks my access to the creek in a dry summer, I lose stock. Lose enough stock, I lose the bank's confidence in the operation. Lose the bank, and I lose the land." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November wind was working on the eaves. "What are your options?" she said. "I'm trying to figure that out." He looked at her. There was something behind the directness, something he was working toward. "Mrs. Hart?" She'd noticed he still used the formal address. She hadn't corrected it. "Wyatt, there's a thing I need to ask you that I don't have a good way to ask." He said it without preamble, which was consistent with everything she knew about how he communicated. "So I'm just going to say it straight, and you can tell me if I've overstepped." "All right." He didn't look away. "If I had a wife, a legal wife, I could file a joint homestead claim on the east pasture and 2 of the parcels that Voss has been contesting. Married couples have standing that single landowners don't under the current territorial code. It complicates his legal angles significantly." He paused. "It also stops the county from questioning who has authority over the operation when I'm out on the range for days at a time. Right now, Voss's man has been making arguments to certain people that a widower with 2 children and no proper household authority is an unstable operation." Elena said nothing. She was listening to all of it, the said and the unsaid. I'm not asking for something that isn't a real thing," Wyatt said, and for the first time she heard him fumble a sentence. I'm asking for a legal arrangement, a practical one. You'd have full standing in the household. You'd have security here. If something happened to me, the boys in the ranch there'd be provision. For you too." He stopped. "I know this is not how this conversation is supposed to go." "How is it supposed to go?" she asked. "I don't know. I haven't had cause to have it before." He looked at his coffee cup. "My wife and I knew each other for 2 years before we married. We had time for things to develop in the normal way. I know that's not I know what I'm proposing here isn't that. Elena looked at her hands on the table. She thought about what she had. $30 a month and room and board and a borrowed space in someone else's life. She thought about Millhaven and Margaret Hart's grip on her elbow. She thought about the hotel in Harlan's Crossing and the money that had been counting down. She thought about Cal asking her about biscuits on the first morning, and Eli's voice saying Agnes, flat and careful and full of things he didn't know how to carry. I'm not what you'd choose, she said. If you had the luxury of choosing. He looked up. I didn't say that. I'm saying it. I'm plain, and I'm not young, and I have history that isn't simple. You should know what you're getting. I know what I'm getting, he said. I've been watching you work for 6 weeks. I know exactly what I'm getting. Something in her chest did a thing she didn't entirely want to examine. I'm not in a position to pretend this is romantic, she said. I think you deserve to hear that plainly. I wasn't asking you to pretend anything, he said. I was asking you to consider a practical arrangement that protects both of us. She looked at him. He looked back. The lamp was low and the wind was in the eaves and the coffee was cold. All right, Elena said. I'll consider it. That's all I'm asking. She considered it for 2 days, which was 1 day more than she'd needed, but she wanted to be honest with herself about her reasons and make sure they were the right ones. Not fear, not desperation, something more like recognition of a situation that asked something real of her and offered something real in return. On the 3rd morning, she came into the kitchen while he was drinking his morning coffee. He did drink it in the morning sometimes, she'd noticed, when the day ahead was heavy. And she said, Yes. If you still want to, yes. He looked up. He hadn't expected her this morning, she could tell. Something in his face moved, not dramatically, just a small adjustment of the muscles around his eyes. I still want to, he said. They married at the Harlan's Crossing Courthouse on a Tuesday in late November, with the county clerk and a passing freighter named Gus serving as witnesses. Cal wore his good shirt and was tremendously pleased about the whole thing in the uncomplicated way of an 8-year-old who has decided something is good and committed to that position fully. Eli wore his good shirt too and said nothing through the brief ceremony, which Elena had expected, and shook her hand afterward with the gravity of someone signing a document. I know this is strange, she said quietly, while Wyatt was dealing with the paperwork. Everything's strange, Eli said, which was the most philosophical thing she'd heard from him. And then Cal grabbed her hand and asked if they were getting lunch, and the moment passed. They had lunch at Mabel's kitchen, where this had all started in a way, and Elena sat across from the 3 of them and watched Cal use his spoon to build a small fortress out of his potatoes, and felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. Something more preliminary than happiness, something that was aware of happiness as a direction. The ride home was quiet. The afternoon was cold and clear, the kind of November sky that's too blue to be entirely trustworthy. Wyatt drove. Cal fell asleep against Elena's arm somewhere around the 3rd mile, with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided a person is safe and acts on that conclusion without deliberation. She didn't move him. Eli, riding on the other side, watched the landscape go by and didn't comment on any of it. Garrett Voss heard about the marriage within 48 hours. Elena didn't know this at the time, but she would come to understand that Voss had people in Harlan's Crossing who reported to him the way weather vanes report wind, automatically, without interpretation, pointing at whatever was moving. What she did know, in the weeks following the wedding, was that something changed in the quality of the pressure on the ranch. It was subtler than she'd expected. Not a direct assault, but a slow accretion of small difficulties. A delivery from the feed supplier that was short by 20%, with apologetic shrugging about availability. A loan renewal at the bank that moved slower than it should have, with the loan officer suddenly requiring additional documentation. 2 of Wyatt's seasonal hands who declined to come back, citing other work, though both had returned every winter for 4 years running. Wyatt noticed all of it. He said less about it than she thought he felt. He's testing the edges, he said one evening, when she'd asked him directly how worried he was. Seeing what gives. What does he want to give? Me. He wants me to get tired and sell. He wants the math to stop working. He leaned against the porch railing, the loose one she'd been meaning to mention, and looked out at the dark pasture. 3 years of this. I keep thinking he'll find easier ground somewhere else. Men like that don't find easier ground, Elena said. They find easier targets. You haven't been easy. He glanced at her sideways. Neither have you, from what I can tell. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment. She decided to take it as one. What she had not accounted for in her assessment of the situation was that Voss was not only watching Wyatt, he was watching her. She found this out through Dory Selden, the wife of a neighboring rancher named Pete Selden, who came by with a pie in the second week of December, in the neighborly way of the territory, and stayed for coffee, and was the first woman in Harlan's Crossing who had treated Elena with straightforward warmth rather than assessment. Dory was a wide-faced, practical woman about 10 years older than Elena, with the particular manner of someone who has survived a few things and decided that life is too short for elaborate social pretense. "I like what you've done with this place," Dory said, looking around the kitchen. Clara, God rest her, wasn't much of a homemaker. She was better with the accounts and the horses. She said it without judgment, just as fact. She and Wyatt were well matched in the ways that mattered. "He speaks well of her," Elena said, because it was true. "He doesn't speak much at all, but when he does..." Dory sipped her coffee. "Listen, I'm going to tell you something because I think you should know. Voss has been asking questions about you." Elena set down her cup carefully. "What kind of questions?" "Your background, your previous marriage, who you were before you came here." Dory held her gaze without drama. "He's got someone looking into it. Pete heard from Ansel Pratt at the feed store, who heard it more or less directly. Voss thinks you're the new weak point." The kitchen was warm and smelled of the bread Elena had pulled out an hour ago and the coffee between them, and underneath all of that was the particular coldness of being evaluated by someone who wanted to use you as a tool for someone else's destruction. "Let him look," Elena said, and meant it. She'd done nothing wrong. But that night, after Dory had gone and the boys were in bed and Wyatt was out checking on the horses, she sat at the kitchen table with Douglas's pocket watch in her hands and thought about Millhaven. About what a man with resources and motivation and no particular commitment to the truth could do with 6 years of marriage to a man who'd died. Douglas had died of fever. The doctor had been clear on that point. She had the documentation. She had nothing to be afraid of. She told herself that. She wound the watch and put it away and went to bed. Christmas came to Boone Creek without much ceremony. They didn't have money for ceremony. But Elena made a proper dinner. Roast chicken because the beef was expensive, sweet potatoes, a pie with the last of the preserved plums, biscuits with the argument over sugar tabled for the occasion because Cal had pointed out that arguing about biscuits on Christmas was maybe not in the spirit of things, and Eli had agreed, which meant Elena had put the sugar in and nobody said a word about it. Wyatt had found, somewhere, a small carved horse for Cal and a new penknife for Eli. Elena had knitted both boys' new scarves out of wool she'd bought in town, which Cal immediately wore inside the house and called the warmest thing he'd ever had on his body, which was an exaggeration but an affectionate one. She hadn't expected anything. She'd been very clear with herself about that. So when Wyatt set a small package on the table in front of her after dinner and sat back with the studied neutrality of a man waiting to see a reaction he isn't sure how to handle, she was genuinely startled. Inside was a pair of leather work gloves, well made, sized for her hands specifically, which meant he'd paid attention and done some calculating. She looked at them. She looked at him. "Your old ones have holes in them," he said, which was true. "It's practical." "It is," she agreed. "It's not... I didn't mean it to be..." He stopped. "I just noticed the holes." "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah. Thank you." He nodded and drank his coffee, and Cal asked if anyone wanted to play cards, and they played cards until Eli declared the activity pointless and went to bed, which was the most festive any of them had been in recent memory. It was not a perfect Christmas. The wind came up hard in the afternoon, and something in the barn needed attention, and Wyatt was gone for an hour and came back cold and smelling of the outside, and the pie was good, but not as good as it could have been, and there was a moment in the evening when Elena caught herself missing nothing specific and everything in general. All the warmth she'd imagined having that had never quite materialized. But then Cal fell asleep with his head in her lap around 9 o'clock, still wearing the scarf, and the fire was low and good, and Wyatt was across the room reading with his boots off, and Eli was somewhere between sleep and awake on the settee, and the house was warm and inhabited and full of the particular kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. Not perfect. Not what any of them would have chosen, maybe, if they'd had other choices. But real. Undeniably, stubbornly real. And somewhere in Harlan's Crossing, a man named Garrett Voss was reading a report about Elena Hart Fowler, formerly of Millhaven, and he was reading it with the concentrated attention of someone who has just found what he was looking for. He had no idea yet how wrong he was about what he'd found. He would spend the next several months learning that lesson, and it would cost him considerably more than he'd planned. On it. But that was still ahead, and for now the fire was warm and the scarf was red, and Cal was asleep and breathing slow, and Elena kept her hands still in her lap and let herself carefully have this one quiet evening without taking it apart to see what it was made of. The first hard frost of January came overnight and left the ranch looking like something out of a picture that was prettier than the reality of breaking ice out of the water troughs at 5 in the morning. Elena had been doing it for 3 weeks by then, had worked out a system. Old wool blanket over the main trough at night, check the secondary one first because it froze faster. Keep the iron bar near the barn door so she didn't have to go looking for it in the dark. She was at the secondary trough working the bar through the crust of ice when she heard hooves on the frozen ground. It was early enough that Wyatt was still in the barn with the horses, and the boys hadn't come out yet. The rider came around the side of the house without announcing himself, which was its own kind of statement. In this country, men who came to your property with good intentions called out from the gate. He was one of Voss's men. She'd seen him twice before in town, always in the background of situations that involved Voss's interests. A thin man named Cord with a face that seemed designed to give nothing away. He stopped his horse about 10 feet from her and looked down. "Mrs. Boone," he said, using the name in a way that made it sound like a question he was skeptical of. She kept her hands on the bar. "What do you want?" It wasn't really a question either. "Mr. Voss asked me to deliver something." He pulled an envelope from his coat and held it out. When she didn't move toward him, he leaned down and set it on the fence post between them. He said to make sure you got it personally. He wrote out the way he'd come. She didn't open it immediately. She finished with the trough, put the bar back where it belonged, went into the kitchen, and started the stove. Then she picked up the envelope from where she'd set it on the table and opened it. It was a single page, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Formal language, legal in its construction, but not from any court she could identify. The substance of it was this, that one Margaret Hart, mother-in-law of Elena Hart, formerly of Millhaven, had submitted a sworn statement to the county office alleging that Elena Hart had, through means of deliberate negligence and possible direct action, contributed to the death of her son Douglas Hart, that this matter was being reviewed. That Elena's presence in Creel County was noted and her whereabouts would be reported to the relevant authorities in Millhaven. She read it twice. Then she put it flat on the table and stood with her hands braced against the wood and breathed through her nose the way she'd learned to do when something inside her wanted to come apart at the seams. Douglas had died of fever. Scarlet fever, which had moved through Millhaven that spring and taken 4 other people, none of whom had wives being accused of anything. She had nursed him. She had been with him at the end. The doctor, a man named Pruitt, who had a practice on Cedar Street and an unblemished reputation for 30 years, had signed the death certificate without hesitation or question. Margaret Hart had known all of this. Margaret Hart had stood at the graveside and accepted condolences and sent Elena away 3 days later with the particular efficiency of a woman disposing of something she'd never wanted in the house. Now apparently Margaret Hart had found a more useful story. Wyatt came in from the barn. He saw her face before he saw the letter, and he stopped in the doorway. "What happened?" She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it standing up, still in his coat. She watched his face. It did not do very much, which she had come to understand meant he was doing a great deal of thinking very quickly. "Voss got to Margaret Hart," she said. "Looks that way." He set the letter down. "What actually happened with your husband?" She looked at him steadily. "He died of fever. 4 other people in Millhaven died of the same fever that same spring." Dr. Pruitt signed the certificate. "I have a copy of it in the bottom of my carpet bag because I kept every document from that marriage that I thought might ever matter." "Good," he said. "I didn't do anything to Douglas." "I know that." "You don't know that," she said. "You've known me 4 months." "I know it," he said again, without elaboration. And the simplicity of it was either the most trusting thing anyone had ever said to her, or the most reckless. and she couldn't decide which. She found to her significant annoyance that her eyes were doing something she didn't want them to do. She turned away and put the kettle on. "We need to find a lawyer," she said. We can't afford not to." She kept her back to him until she had herself settled. "If Voss has convinced Margaret Hart to make a formal accusation, he can drag this out long enough to damage us even if I'm cleared. Reputation is what he's after. He doesn't need a conviction. He needs the county talking." Wyatt was quiet behind her for a long moment. "There's a man named Aldous Webb," he said finally. "He practices in Caldwell Junction. He's honest. He's not cheap. Can you get us a meeting? I can ride out tomorrow." "Then ride out tomorrow." The county started talking within the week. Elena learned this through the particular medium of silences. The way Orrin Fitch at the general store was slightly more deliberate in his movements when she came in. Not rude, not overtly hostile, but the way a man moves when he's heard something and is still deciding what to do with it. The way two women she'd nodded to on the street in Harlan's Crossing nodded back this time with a fraction less warmth and a fraction more attention, as though she'd become more interesting and less trustworthy at the same time. Dory Selden came by on Thursday. "I wanted you to hear it from a friend," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table with her coat still on. "The story's going around. Garrett Voss had supper at the Holloways on Tuesday and told it himself, which means he wanted it in wide circulation fast. He said there was a formal complaint filed in Millhaven about you." "There is," Elena said. "Filed by my former mother-in-law, who was encouraged to file it by Voss." Dory's jaw tightened. He framed it like he was concerned, like he was sharing information out of duty to the community. Her voice carried the particular contempt of a person who recognizes performance. "Some people will believe it, some won't." "How many will believe it?" Dory was honest enough not to soften it, enough to make it uncomfortable for a while. Elena nodded and poured the coffee and sat down. "What are you going to do?" Dory asked. "Fight it. Aldous Webb is taking our case." Dory raised her eyebrows. "Webb's good, expensive." "Yes." Dory looked at her, the particular look of a woman assessing another woman's backbone, which is a different calculation than the one men make. "You're not running?" "Where would I run to?" Elena said. There was no bitterness in it. It was just the geography of her situation, stated plainly. "This is my house. Those are my boys. I'm not going anywhere." Dory picked up her coffee cup. "Good," she said, with some force. Webb was a compact, gray-haired man who wore his suits like he'd been born in them, and had a mind that reminded Elena of a very well-organized filing cabinet. He could locate any relevant fact with no visible effort and understood immediately the architecture of what Voss had constructed. "It's clever," he said, spreading the documents across his desk in Caldwell Junction, while Elena and Wyatt sat across from him. "Not the legal argument. The legal argument is thin, but as a strategy for applying social pressure while the ranch is already financially stressed, it's well constructed." "Can it be beaten?" Wyatt asked. "In court? Yes. The death certificate, the attending physician's record, the documented fact that 4 other people died of the same fever in the same period, that's dispositive. No jury with functional reasoning will convict on what's been presented." Webb tapped his pen against the desk. "The problem isn't the courtroom. The problem is the time between now and the courtroom. Voss knows the legal case is weak. He filed this to buy himself 6 to 8 weeks of your reputation being in question while he moves on the water rights." "How do we cut that time short?" Elena asked. Webb looked at her with the evaluating attention of a man who'd spent 30 years assessing clients. "We file for an expedited hearing. We get Prewitt on the record. We get the Millhaven death records and the documentation on the other fever victims." He paused. "And we need you to be visible." "Visible? In the county. Not hiding, not looking frightened. The story Voss is selling depends on you behaving like someone with something to hide. If you're seen going about your business calmly, it complicates the narrative." He looked at Wyatt. "Both of you." Wyatt nodded once. Elena was already thinking about the following Sunday, when Harlan's Crossing held its weekly market on the main street and how many people would be there, and what it would cost her to walk through it with her head level and her hands steady. Quite a lot, she suspected. She went anyway. The market was the way it always was. crowded and loud and smelling of livestock and fresh bread, and the particular sharpness of winter air carrying everyone's breath. Elena went with Dory, which was Dory's suggestion, and a strategically sound one. There is a significant difference between a woman facing a crowd alone and a woman walking beside someone the town has known and trusted for 15 years. People looked. People always look. She had known they would look, and she had prepared herself for it, the way you prepare for cold water. Knowing it's going to hit you, knowing it's going to be worse than you imagined, deciding to go in anyway. A woman she didn't know well gave her a very pointed look near the bread stall, and said, in the carrying voice of someone who wanted to be overheard, "I understand you've had some trouble with the law, Mrs. Boone." Elena stopped. She hadn't planned to stop, but stopping turned out to be the right instinct, because walking away looked like flinching, and she'd made a decision about flinching. "There's a complaint filed by a woman in Millhaven who was not kind to me during my marriage, and appears to still not be kind to me after it," Elena said, loud enough and even enough. "It will be addressed in court. I'm not concerned about it. Are you finding everything you need today, Mrs. Fenner?" the woman said, taken slightly aback by the directness. "Mrs. Fenner. The bread here is good, the cornmeal loaf especially." She walked on. Dory said under her breath, "Well." "Was that wrong?" Elena said, also under her breath. "No, that was exactly right." A pause. "My heart rate went up, and I wasn't even the one doing it. But..." The weeks that followed were among the hardest Elena had lived, and she had a reasonable point of comparison. The legal machinery moved slowly by design, and in the space between the filing of Webb's motion for expedited hearing and the court date that was finally assigned, late February, 6 weeks out, Voss applied pressure with the patience of someone who'd done this before. 2 more of Wyatt's supply contacts became suddenly unavailable. The bank sent a letter requesting a meeting to review the current status of the outstanding loan, which was bank language for, "We've heard things, and we're nervous, and you should be nervous too." Someone painted 2 words on the barn door one night. Elena didn't see them until morning and made sure she was the one who painted over them before the boys came out, which meant she had to get up early and work fast, and then stand with wet paint on her hands and something hot and ugly in her chest that she had to breathe through for a while before she could go start breakfast. She didn't tell Wyatt about the words. She thought about whether she should and decided that there was a limit to how many things he needed to carry right now, and some of them were hers to handle. Eli saw the fresh paint. He didn't say anything at breakfast, but in the afternoon he came and found her in the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment before he said, "The paint on the barn. That was you this morning." "Yes." "What was on it before?" She looked at him. He was 11 years old and had a man's quality of stillness and a child's eyes. "Nothing worth repeating," she said. He thought about that. He came into the kitchen and picked up a dish towel and started drying the plates she'd left on the counter, which was not something he did without being asked. "People say things when they're afraid of something," he said. He was looking at the plate in his hands. "Or when someone's paying them to say things." "That's true," she said. "My pa says Voss has been paying people to say things about us for 3 years. Your pa's right." Eli put the plate down. He looked at her with those careful eyes that had been evaluating her since October. "I told the Grundy boy at school today that if he repeated what his father said about you at the dinner table, I was going to make him sorry about it." Elena set down the pot she was holding. "Eli, he repeated it anyway, so I made him sorry about it." A pause. "I got in trouble. Pa's going to hear about it from the school teacher, probably." "You shouldn't fight about..." "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. He had Clara's coloring she'd gathered from the photograph she'd seen once. The dark hair, the particular way his jaw was set. But that stubbornness was Wyatt's. Or maybe it was just the stubbornness of people who'd decided that certain things were worth standing for and others weren't. "Go wash your hands before dinner," she said, "and when your father hears about it, you tell him the truth." "I was going to, anyway." He went. She picked up the pot again and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The particular sensation of being defended, which was different from being protected. Protection comes from strength. Defense comes from choice. The court date was February 23rd, and the hearing was held in the Harlan's Crossing Courthouse, which was a single wood-framed room that served as both the location of civic proceedings and, on alternate Fridays, a meeting room for the local Cattlemen's Association. The judge was a circuit judge named Harmon Pruitt, who wrote his schedule through 5 counties and had the deeply weary efficiency of a man who'd presided over more human foolishness than he could reasonably account for. Webb had done his work. The documents from Millhaven had arrived: Pruitt's medical record, the death certificates of the 4 other fever victims, the official death certificate for Douglas Hart signed and dated and specific. Webb had also, through channels he didn't explain in detail, obtained a written statement from a neighbor in Millhaven named Cecile Graves, who had been in the Hart household twice during Douglas's illness and had observed Elena nursing him with consistent and attentive care. Voss's attorney was a man named Prescott, slicker than Webb, younger, with the practiced confidence of someone who fought with language the way others fought with their hands. He'd brought Margaret Hart to the stand, or rather he'd arranged for her deposition to be read into the record, because Margaret was in Millhaven, and the cost of transporting her to Harlan's Crossing outweighed whatever she was worth to Voss's case. The deposition was read by a court clerk in the flat, a feckless voice of someone for whom the content was purely professional. In it, Margaret Hart stated that she had long harbored suspicions about the nature of her son's decline, that Elena had been resistant to calling a doctor. This was false. Elena had sent for Pruitt on the 2nd day, that Elena had seemed, in Margaret's assessment, insufficiently distressed by her husband's death, which was the kind of evidence that made Webb tap his pen against his notepad in a way that conveyed without words that he would enjoy taking that apart. He did enjoy taking it apart. The question of a widow's emotional expression is not a legal standard, he said to Judge Pruitt, with the precise economy of a man who doesn't waste words on uncertain ground. Mrs. Boone's grief or its absence is not at issue. What is at issue is whether there is any evidence of wrongdoing. There is not. Dr. Pruitt's record is unambiguous. The pattern of illness in Millhaven that spring is documented. The death was consistent with a known disease circulating actively in the community. Prescott argued for 30 minutes that the documentation was insufficient and the investigation should continue. Webb replied for 10 minutes that it was not insufficient, that Prescott had not produced a single piece of medical evidence to contradict it, and that continuing the case would represent a misuse of the court's time and a clear injustice to his client. Judge Pruitt, who had presided over significantly more complex matters than this and could identify a thin case with the speed of long experience, asked Prescott if he had any medical evidence to present. Prescott said he did not at this time, but that he expected to obtain. "Then we're done," Pruitt said, not unkindly, but with absolute finality. Case dismissed. Mrs. Boone's record stands clear. The courtroom, which was full because Harlan's Crossing did not have an abundance of events of this caliber and people had shown up, made a sound. Not dramatic, not a gasp or a cheer, more like a collective exhale, the sound of a room releasing the pressure it had been holding. Elena sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the judge's bench and did not do anything for a moment because she needed the moment to absorb the fact that it was over, at least this part of it, at least the legal part. Wyatt's hand came to rest on hers briefly. Just a moment, just a pressure, and then was gone. She became aware, coming back into the full sensory experience of the room, that Garrett Voss was sitting 3 rows back on the other side of the aisle. She had known he was there. She'd seen him when she came in. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the groomed quality of someone who spent money on his appearance as a statement about his position. He'd been watching the proceedings with the focused attention of a chess player watching the board. Now he was watching her. She turned her head and looked at him directly. He didn't look away. He smiled, a small, controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes, that said, "This was one move and I have others." She held his gaze until he broke it, which he did, turning to murmur something to Prescott. Webb was already packing his documents. "That went as expected," he said quietly. "The case was never strong." "He didn't build it to win it," Elena said. "No," Webb agreed. "He built it to cost you. It's done some of that." "Yes," she said, "but not as much as he wanted." The ride home from the courthouse was not triumphant. Triumph would have required more certainty about what came next, and all 3 of them, Wyatt, Webb, Elena, were too experienced at practical thinking to mistake a legal victory for safety. The boys were at the Selden Ranch for the day, Pete and Dory having offered to take them so they wouldn't be in the courthouse. Cal, Dory had reported that morning, had declared that he wanted to come and tell the judge his stepmother didn't do anything wrong, and had to be redirected with the promise of helping Pete with the horses. When they picked the boys up that evening, Cal ran out of the Selden house and launched himself at Elena with the full-body commitment of a child who has been worried and is expressing relief through the only medium available. "Dory said you won," he said into her coat. "The case was dismissed," Elena said. "That's the same as winning." "More or less." He leaned back and looked up at her with that direct, uncomplicated face. "Did you tell the judge that Voss is a bad man?" "That's not exactly how courts work, Cal." "It should be." Eli was standing back a little, watching. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod, the way men nod when they've sized up a situation and found it satisfactory. It was an absurd gesture from an 11-year-old, and she found it almost unbearably affecting. "Come on," Wyatt said. "Let's go home." Decked. Home was different after the hearing. Not in the grand sense. The ranch was the same, the work was the same, the financial pressure was the same. But something in the texture of daily life had shifted. The looks in town were different, not all of them warm, but different. Several people who had been watching from a distance made a point of speaking to her directly. The banker's wife, who stopped her on the street and said she was glad the matter had been resolved. Old Fitch at the general store, who was suddenly somewhat more forthcoming than he'd been in the preceding weeks. Dory came by on Saturday and brought her daughter Ruth, a quiet girl of 12 who looked at Elena with the frank admiration of a child who has been told a story that impressed her. "I heard you stared down Voss in the courtroom," Dory said. "I looked at him," Elena said. "Ruth, this is what we call understatement." Dory sat down. "He's furious, by the way. Prescott's been seen at his house twice since the hearing. He's not done." "I know he's not done," Elena said. "What do you think he does next?" Elena thought about the smile, the chess player's smile. "He stops using the law," she said. "He's tried land claims, he's tried supply pressure, he's tried reputation. The law didn't work for him. He'll go around it." Dory was quiet for a moment. "Pete's been hearing things," she said carefully, "about Voss bringing in outside men. Not ranch hands, the other kind." The kitchen held that for a moment. "How many?" Elena asked. "Pete doesn't know. 3, maybe 4. Saw them himself at the Voss place when he rode past." Elena looked at her hands on the table. The new work gloves were on the hook by the door, the ones Wyatt had given her at Christmas. The ones that were practical and deliberate and told her something about how he noticed things. She thought about what Wyatt would do with this information. She thought about what she would do with it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. After Dory left, she sat for a while. The house was warm and the lamp was lit against the late afternoon dark, and she could hear Wyatt somewhere outside, and the boys, and the ordinary sounds of a place that had become, without her quite arranging it, the most real thing she had. She had been a woman who believed she was at the end of her road when the axle broke in Harlan's Crossing. She had believed it the way you believe things that have been told to you so many times they start to feel like facts about the weather, immutable, impersonal, not worth fighting. She didn't believe it anymore. Garrett Voss had spent months trying to find her weak point, and she had spent months discovering that what he'd found instead was the thing she hadn't known she had. The particular stubborn quality of a woman who has survived enough to understand that survival isn't luck. It's a decision made again and again every morning, every time something tries to take from you what you've built. He had hired men. He had men and guns and money and the patience of someone accustomed to winning by exhaustion. She had 3 weeks of notes in her handwriting and a county that had just watched Voss try to destroy an innocent woman in their courthouse. She had Pete Selden and Dory and Aldous Webb and a rancher who had put his hand over hers for exactly 1 second in a courtroom and meant something by it that neither of them had put into words yet. She had Eli, who defended her on the school grounds with his fists, and Cal, who would have told the judge the truth if anyone had let him. It was not nothing. It was, she was beginning to understand, quite a lot. Outside, the light was failing. Inside, the lamp held. She got up and started dinner. The first thread arrived on a Monday, which was laundry day, and Elena found it tucked under a stone on the porch steps sometime between the first load going up on the line and the second coming out of the wash basin. A folded piece of paper with 4 words written on it in heavy, deliberate strokes. Sell or regret it. She stood on the porch with wet hands and read it twice. Then she folded it back along its crease, put it in her apron pocket, finished hanging the laundry, and brought it inside to show Wyatt when he came in for the midday meal. He read it without expression, set it on the table, picked it up again, and read it a second time, the way he processed things that needed sitting with. "He's moving faster than I expected," he said. "He lost patience in the courtroom," Elena said. "Men like that, when the formal approach stops working, they don't take time to recalibrate. They accelerate. You sound like you know men like that." "I spent 6 years watching Margaret Hart operate," she said. "Different scale, same mechanism. When they can't control a situation through legitimate means, the next step is intimidation. They want you to feel like the walls are moving in." "Are the walls moving in?" She looked at him steadily. "Not from where I'm standing." He held her gaze for a moment. "All right." He put the note in the desk drawer, the one with the survey documents and the lease paperwork and the growing collection of evidence of everything Voss had been doing for 3 years. "I'm going to talk to Pete Selden this afternoon." "Good. And Wyatt," she stopped him at the door, "don't go alone to the outer pastures for a while. Take Eli with you, or one of the Selden hands." He started to say something that would have been some version of, "I can handle myself." She could see it forming. He stopped. He'd learned, in the months they'd been living alongside each other, that when she said something direct, it was because she'd already thought it through, and the thinking had led somewhere specific. "All right," he said. Book it. The second threat was less subtle. 3 nights after the note, at somewhere past midnight, a sound brought Elena out of sleep with the particular snap of a person who has been sleeping lightly by habit. She was at the window before she was fully conscious of being awake. 3 riders at the edge of the south pasture, not moving toward the house, just sitting there in the dark, visible because the moon was half full and the sky was clear. Just sitting, watching. She watched back from the dark of her room for long enough to be certain they weren't coming forward. Then she went down the hall and knocked on Wyatt's door. He opened it almost immediately, which meant he'd been awake already or had the same quality of light sleeping she did. "Riders," she said quietly. "South pasture. 3 of them. They're not advancing, just sitting there." He came to the window at the end of the hall. They stood side by side in the dark and looked at the 3 shapes at the pasture's edge. "It's a message," he said. "I know what it is." They stayed at the window for 20 minutes until the riders turned and moved off into the dark. Neither of them went back to sleep. In the morning, Wyatt rode to the Selden place before breakfast. Elena made eggs and didn't tell the boys about the riders. She told Eli about them that afternoon, privately, because he was old enough to need to know and would find out anyway, and she preferred he hear it from her rather than piece it together from overheard fragments. He took it with the composure he brought to most things that frightened him, which was the composure of a child who'd decided that fear was information, not a verdict. "What do we do?" he asked. "We don't change our routine in ways that look like panic," Elena said. "We're more careful. Your father's talking to the Seldens about keeping watch, but we go on working." "That's what you're doing," Eli said. It wasn't a question. "That's what I'm doing," she confirmed. He nodded, went back outside. She saw him, from the kitchen window, stop at the barn door and stand there for a moment with his hand on the frame, just breathing, before he went in. 12 years old and carrying things she wished he didn't have to carry. But there wasn't anything to do about that, except not lie to him about the weight. Pete Selden came by that evening with his eldest hand, a taciturn man named Garvey, who had the useful quality of being very large and entirely unimpressed by most threats. The 4 of them, Pete, Garvey, Wyatt, Elena, sat at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed, and Elena put out coffee and then sat down herself, which nobody questioned. "I put the word out to 3 other ranches," Pete said. "Morrison over on the East Road, the Hatch brothers, old Delbert Kane. They're all getting something from Voss, one kind of pressure or another. Hatch lost 2 sections to that competing claim nonsense last fall. Morrison's water was diverted without explanation in the dry stretch back in September." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Nobody was willing to say it out loud before. After the courtroom, they're more willing." "Willing to do what specifically?" Wyatt asked. "To be counted." Pete looked at him. Voss's operation works because everyone deals with him alone. He picks one at a time and applies enough pressure that the individual breaks before he runs out of pressure to apply. If we stop being individuals about it, his arithmetic changes. He has hired men, Elena said. Dory mentioned 3, maybe 4. Cord and at least 2 others I haven't seen clearly. I've seen them, Garvey said. It was the first thing he'd said. He had a voice that seemed to come from a lower register than most people's. 4. 2 of them have a reputation from further south, not ranch hands. Hired trouble, Pete said. That's a polite way to put it, Garvey said. Wyatt looked at the table. Elena watched him doing the calculations she'd seen him do before. Not fast, not slow, just thorough. Adding up what was on one side and what was on the other and being honest with himself about the difference. Even with the Seldins and the others, we're not going to outgun hired men in a direct confrontation, he said. No, Pete agreed. But a direct confrontation is the last thing Voss wants on the record. He's been operating in the gray spaces. He puts hired guns on the road, they do something that can't be walked back, and suddenly he's not a businessman applying pressure. He's something the territorial marshal takes an interest in. Elena had been thinking about this since the conversation with Dory. She said, Webb mentioned the territorial marshal once, said Voss had been careful enough that there was never sufficient grounds for federal involvement. He's been careful, Pete said. He's also been getting less careful. The note you got, the writers, that's less careful than the land claims and the supply pressure. When people get impatient, they get sloppy. We need to document everything, Elena said. Every threat, every incident, with dates and specifics. Webb needs to build a file. If Voss gives the marshal grounds to act, we need the record to already exist. Webb, when she'd spoken to him that afternoon by wire through the telegraph office in Harlan's Crossing, had said the same thing in different words. Document everything. Keep your heads. Don't give them a reason to make you the problem. She had been documenting since February. The note from Monday was already written up in the back of the household ledger with a date and a description. The writers were in there now too, with the time and what she'd observed. The other thing, Elena said, is that we shouldn't wait for the marshal to come to us. If we send a formal complaint to the territorial office, signed by multiple landowners, with documentation, it changes the position we're in. The men at the table looked at her. I can draft it, she said. I drafted the letter that got Purvis to pay. I can draft a complaint that makes the pattern visible. Pete looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Elena. Draft it, he said. She wrote it over 3 nights at the kitchen table, after everyone else was in bed, with the lamp turned up and Douglas's pocket watch sitting on the corner of the table where she could see it. Not for sentiment exactly, more because it had been with her through the hardest years, and it seemed fitting to have it here too. The complaint was 12 pages. It documented the land claims, the supply interference, the loan pressures, the hired letter sent through Prescott, the false accusation built from Margaret Hart's statement, the threatening note, the midnight riders. It named Voss directly. It named Fenwick at the land office and the specific interactions that suggested a corrupted relationship. It named Cord and described the early morning visit with the envelope. She was not an attorney, but she had read more legal documents in the past 4 months than she had in her previous 28 years, and she'd learned how they worked, what they needed to establish, in what order, with what specificity. She wrote it like she was explaining a set of accounts to someone who hadn't seen the ledger. Step by step, fact by fact. Webb read it by telegraph relay over 2 days, with her wiring sections to his office in Caldwell Junction. His response was 4 words. Send it as written. 6 ranchers signed it. Wyatt and Elena, the Seldins, Morrison, both Hatch brothers, and old Delbert Kane, who wrote in himself to put his signature on it with the slow deliberateness of a man who'd been waiting for someone to start this particular fight for a long time. Voss fenced off my creek access in 1879, Kane said, sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his lap. He was about 70, lean and weathered, with the patience of very old wood. I never could prove it was intentional, but I knew. It was intentional, Elena said. I know that now. He signed, looked at the signature. Your husband's a good man. He is, she said. You're a good woman, he said, with the directness of someone who doesn't have the time left for indirect compliments. She didn't know quite what to do with that. Thank you, Mr. Kane. The The complaint went to the territorial marshal's office in the first week of March. For 10 days, nothing overt happened, and the nothing was its own kind of pressure. Elena knew they were in the space between moves. Voss knew about the complaint. He had people in enough places that he would know quickly, and was deciding what to do with that information. Men like him had two responses to formal pressure: retreat and regroup, or escalate before the formal machinery could act. She told Wyatt she thought he'd escalate. "Why?" he said. "Because retreating means accepting that we've constrained him, and accepting that means the other ranchers know they can constrain him too. It changes his position in the county permanently." She was at the stove, which was where she often was when she was thinking, because doing something with her hands made the thinking clearer. He'd rather force a resolution on his terms before the marshal responds than let the process play out. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've been thinking about it since December." He was at the table, and she heard his chair shift. "Elena." She turned. He had the expression he wore when he was going to say something that cost him something to say. She'd learned to recognize it, the slight tightening around the eyes, the deliberate way he'd set down whatever he was holding. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "When I asked you to marry me," he said, "I told you it was a practical arrangement. I laid it out like a business proposition, and I think I made it easier for myself by framing it that way, when the truth was more complicated than that." He looked at his hands on the table. "I noticed you before I needed a cosigner on a land claim. I want you to know that." Oh. The kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled of the stew she was making, and Elena stood with a wooden spoon in her hand and looked at this man who'd given her work gloves for Christmas and signed off on her letters without changing a word, and slept lightly enough to know when she knocked on his door at midnight. "I know," she said. He looked up. "I noticed too," she said. Before I said yes, something in his face settled. Not a smile exactly. Wyatt didn't smile easily, but a loosening of something that had been held for a while. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, and turned back to the stove, and neither of them said anything else about it that evening, which was somehow the right amount. Voss came on a Thursday afternoon, and he brought 5 men. Elena saw them from the kitchen window. The dust first, then the shapes, then the specifics. 5 riders, Voss in front on a bay horse she recognized from town, Cord on his left. 3 others she'd seen at distance, but not up close. They came through the gate at the end of the drive without stopping, which was not how you came to someone's property unless you intended the arrival itself to be a statement. She went to the hall and called up the stairs. "Eli." He appeared at the top immediately, which meant he'd heard the hooves too. "Take Cal out the back and go to the barn. Stay inside. Don't come out until I come get you." He looked at her. He was 12 years old and smart enough to understand the full context of what she was saying, which meant he was also scared, which he was not going to admit. "Where's Pa?" he said. "Coming from the south pasture. He'll have seen the dust." She held his gaze. "I need you to take care of Cal. That's the most important thing right now. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "Go." They went. She went back to the kitchen, opened the cabinet beside the back door, took out the rifle Wyatt kept there loaded, and carried it to the front of the house. She checked the load the way Wyatt had shown her twice, matter-of-factly, the first time in November when she'd asked him to show her. She went to the front door and opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. Voss and his men were pulling up in the yard below. She stood at the top of the porch steps with the rifle in the crook of her arm, not raised, not pointed at anyone, just held, plainly visible, and waited. Garrett Voss was, up close, a man who'd spent a considerable time constructing himself as an authority. Everything about him was designed to convey that he occupied a higher position than whoever he was speaking to. The quality of his coat, the way he sat a horse, the particular pitch of his voice when he spoke, which was confident in the way of someone who'd rarely been told no by anyone in a position to make it stick. He looked at her on the porch, and she saw something flicker across his face that she identified as surprise, quickly suppressed. He'd expected Wyatt, or he'd expected an empty house, a door to knock on, a woman to be intimidated into getting her husband. He hadn't expected to find her standing there already. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you're on private property." I've come to speak to your husband. He'll be here shortly. You're welcome to wait at the gate. She didn't move from where she stood. Or you can say what you came to say to me. Voss's eyes went to the rifle. He kept his expression controlled, but one of the men to his right shifted in the saddle, which was its own kind of communication. I think it's better if I wait for Wyatt, Voss said, with the studied patience of a man recalculating. I disagree, Elena said. Anything you have to say about this ranch, its land, or its operation is my business as much as my husband's. So say it. Cord, to Voss's left, had a particular stillness that she understood was the stillness of someone deciding what kind of situation they were in. She kept her attention on Voss, but was aware of Cord, the way you're aware of weather coming in from the side. You've filed a complaint with the territorial marshal, Voss said. That's correct. That was unwise. I disagree with that too, she said. It was very wise. We documented 12 instances of interference with legitimate land operations over a 3-year period. 6 landowners signed it. The marshal's office will respond to it because they're required to, and when they do, everything that's happened in this county is going to be examined. She let that sit for a moment. You had a long run at people who were dealing with you one at a time. That's over. Voss's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but she caught it. You're a clever woman, he said, and it was not a compliment. I'm an accurate woman, she said. There's a difference. She heard hooves behind the house, coming fast from the south, and then Pete Selden's voice calling something she couldn't make out. And then Wyatt came around the corner of the house on horseback and pulled up sharply when he saw the yard. His eyes went to Elena first, then to Voss, then to the 5 men. He swung down from his horse and came to stand at the bottom of the porch steps. From somewhere down the road, more hooves. Elena didn't look, but she heard them, and she heard Pete Selden's voice more clearly now, and another voice she recognized as Garvey's, and a third she thought was Morrison. Voss heard them too. His eyes moved to the road. Pete came through the gate first, with Garvey beside him and Morrison just behind. And behind them old Delbert Kane moving at his own pace on a horse that was as unhurried as its rider. They arranged themselves at the edge of the yard without theatrical positioning, just present, visible, not going anywhere. Voss looked at the yard. He looked at Wyatt at the bottom of the steps. He looked at Elena at the top of them. He looked at the assembled neighbors at the gate. This doesn't end here, he said. I know, Elena said. We'll see you in the marshal's process. For a long moment, nobody moved. The afternoon was cold and bright, and the horses moved their feet, and someone's harness jingled, and Cord's particular stillness remained particular and watchful. Then Voss turned his horse. His men turned with him, the choreography of people who've done it before. And they rode out through the gate, past Pete and Garvey, and the others who didn't move to give them more room than they strictly needed. They went down the road, and the dust came up behind them, and then they were gone around the bend. Elena let out a breath that was slower and longer than the ones that had come before it. Wyatt turned and looked up at her. She was still holding the rifle. She became aware of this and felt, for the first time since she'd picked it up, slightly self-conscious about it. Were you out here the whole time? He said. Since before they pulled up. He held her gaze. You stepped out before you knew who was coming. I knew who was coming when I saw the dust. She came down the steps. Her knees were doing something they hadn't been doing while she was standing, a slight unsteadiness that she attributed to the post-tension drop in whatever had been keeping her upright for the last 20 minutes. She made sure it didn't show in her walk. Pete Selden came across the yard. His face had an expression that was somewhere between impressed and something more complicated. Garvey spotted them on the road from Voss's place, Pete said. We figured we'd come see what the occasion was. I'm glad you did, Wyatt said. Looked to me, Pete said, like the occasion was mostly handled. He glanced at Elena when he said it. She met his eyes and didn't say anything, because sometimes the right response to a statement like that is to just let it stand. Afterward, after Pete and the others had coffee and stayed for an hour, and left in the easy way of people who've confirmed something they already believed about each other, after Eli and Cal came out of the barn and Cal described in exhaustive detail how he had been very brave and not scared at all, which Eli contradicted with a single raised eyebrow, after dinner and the dishes and the boys in bed, Elena sat on the porch. The cold was real, but she wanted the air. Wyatt came out and sat in the other chair without being asked. They'd gotten to that point over the winter, the point where certain presences don't require invitation. "He'll be back," she said. "Not like today. Something different." Webb says the marshal's office confirmed receipt of the complaint. They've assigned someone. "How long?" "Weeks, probably. Maybe longer." She nodded. The stars were very clear and very cold, and the pasture was dark and still. "You could have waited inside," Wyatt said. "When you saw the riders." "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She thought about it honestly. Not the answer that sounded right, but the actual answer. "Because I've spent most of my life waiting inside," she said. "Waiting for things to be decided about me by other people in other rooms. I decided a while ago I was done with that." He was quiet for a moment. "When did you decide that?" "I'm not sure exactly. Somewhere between the hotel in Harlan's Crossing and your kitchen." She looked out at the dark. "Maybe when Cal asked me if I could make biscuits." She heard something in the dark that might have been a laugh, very quiet, the kind Wyatt kept mostly to himself. "He asks everybody that," he said. "I know, but he asked me like the answer was going to matter." She pulled her coat tighter. "It's a small thing, but I needed a small thing at that point." The night was cold and the house was warm behind them, and Voss was out there somewhere with his hired men and his patience and his intention to make their lives impossible. And Pete Selden and Garvey and Morrison and old Delbert Kane had ridden down a road to stand in a yard because they'd decided to stop being alone about it. And Elena was on her own porch, in the cold, next to a man who'd sat down without being asked, and for the moment that was enough. "Come inside," Wyatt said after a while. "It's too cold out here." "In a minute," she said. He went in. She stayed another minute, looking at the dark pasture, the stars, the gate at the end of the drive that Voss had ridden through like he owned the approach to her home. Then she went inside. She locked the door behind her. She left the lamp on in the kitchen, the way she always did on the hard evenings. And in the morning she got up before the frost and went to the water trough with the iron bar, because the work didn't stop because the night had been difficult, and she had long ago stopped expecting it to. The marshal's man arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the complaint had been filed, and he was not what Elena had expected. She'd imagined someone official-looking, pressed and deliberate, the way authority tends to present itself when it wants to be taken seriously. Deputy Marshal Cole Ferris was none of those things. He was about 40, medium height, with a coat that had seen considerable weather and a manner that was more accountant than lawman. He asked questions quietly, wrote things down in a small notebook, and did not appear to be impressed by anything he encountered, which she recognized after a while as not indifference but a very practiced form of attention. He spent the first day at the ranch going through the documentation Elena had compiled. All of it. The ledger entries with dates and descriptions, the note from Voss, the timeline of supply interference, the records of the competing land claims, Webb's correspondence, the complete file she'd been building since December with the same systematic care she'd brought to the household accounts. Ferris sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours. He asked her questions twice and Wyatt questions once, and then he asked her 3 more questions and wrote for a long time. When he finally closed the notebook, he looked at her across the table. "This is the most organized complaint documentation I've received in 11 years of this work," he said. It was not flattery. He said it the way you note a fact about the weather. "I wanted it to be useful," Elena said. "It is." He put the notebook in his coat. "I'll need to speak to the other signatories, and I'll need to visit the land office." "Fenwick," she said. "Yes." He said the name without expression, but something around his eyes tightened briefly. "I'm aware of Fenwick." He rode out to the Selden place that afternoon, and to Morrison's the following morning, and spent an afternoon at the Hatch brothers' property, and visited old Delbert Kane, who Elena heard later had given Ferris a 2-hour account of every grievance he had accumulated against Garrett Voss since 1879, with dates, which delighted her when she heard it. On the 4th day, Ferris rode to Harlan's Crossing. Elena didn't know what happened in the land office specifically. She found out pieces of it later in the way you find out things in small counties, through Dory, through Pete, through the particular telegraph of community knowledge that moves faster than official communication. What she gathered was that Ferris had sat down with Fenwick for approximately 90 minutes and had brought with him documents from the territorial office that Fenwick had not known existed, relating to a separate investigation into land office irregularities in 2 other counties where Voss had also been active. That Fenwick had, by the end of those 90 minutes, made a decision about which side of the situation represented better odds for his future. That he had provided Ferris with records that detailed the specific arrangements between his office and Voss's operation in terms that were considerably more concrete than anything in Elena's complaint. This was the part Voss hadn't accounted for. He'd spent years keeping each of his operations separate: the land claims, the supply pressure, the legal harassment, the corruption at the land office. He'd kept them separate because he understood that the whole picture was damning in a way the individual pieces weren't. What he hadn't anticipated was someone building the whole picture from the outside, piece by piece, with the patience of a woman who'd learned in 6 years of difficult marriage that the only way to survive a situation designed to exhaust you is to outlast it. Ferris returned to the ranch on the 5th evening. He told Wyatt and Elena, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee he didn't drink, that he had sufficient grounds for a formal warrant, that the territorial prosecutor's office had been notified, that an arrest was expected within 10 days pending the prosecutor's review. "Voss?" Wyatt said. "Voss," Ferris confirmed, "and Fenwick, possibly Prescott, depending on what the prosecutor decides about the harassment complaint." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. 10 days, Elena said. "Approximately. It could move faster." He looked at her. "In the meantime, I'd recommend continued documentation of any contact from Voss or his men, and I'd recommend not being alone on the property." "We've been managing that," she said. "I can see that." He stood. "Mrs. Boone, the complaint you wrote was what made this viable. I want you to know that. The other ranchers' signatures mattered, but your documentation is what gave the prosecutor something to build on." She walked him to the door. He mounted his horse, nodded once, and rode down the dark drive toward the road. She stood on the porch for a moment in the cold. 10 days, maybe less. After 3 years of Wyatt fighting alone and 4 months of fighting alongside him, 10 days felt both very short and very long. Voss moved on the 7th day. She supposed later that he'd heard something, that Fenwick had talked, or that Prescott had, or that one of his supply contacts in the county had enough information to put the picture together. Men with that much money and that many arrangements always have more lines of information than anyone fully accounts for. He came in the early morning, before full light, not with 5 men this time, with 7. Elena was at the water trough when she heard the gate. She heard it specifically because she'd oiled the hinge herself the previous week and knew exactly what sound it made when it opened at speed, which was different from the slow creak of ordinary use. She left the iron bar where it was and moved toward the house. Wyatt was already on the porch. He'd heard it too. "Go inside," he said. "No," she said, and went up the steps to stand beside him. He didn't argue. There wasn't time. The riders came up the drive fast enough that the ground shook slightly under them, and then they pulled up in the yard in the gray pre-dawn light, 7 of them, Voss in the middle. His coat was not pressed this time. His hat was pulled low. He had the look of a man who'd been awake for some time making decisions he couldn't walk back. Cord was on his right. The 3 from the Southern Territory that Garvey had identified were there, positioned slightly apart from the others, with the deliberate spacing of men who knew how to arrange themselves in confrontational situations. "Boone," Voss said. Not Mrs. Boone this time. The pretense of civility was gone. "Voss," Wyatt said, "the marshal's process stops if you sell me the property today. I have papers here. Fair value, which is more than you'll get from whoever buys the debt when the bank calls the loan." He said it with the flatness of a man who's moved past persuasion into simple statement of options. "This is the last time I make this offer." Wyatt said nothing. Elena said, "The marshal's process doesn't stop because you buy the property. You understand that, don't you? Fenwick has already talked." Something went across Voss's face that she hadn't seen there before. She had seen him controlled, calculating, briefly angry, and she'd seen the chess player's smile. She hadn't seen him uncertain. It lasted only a second, but it was there. "Fenwick doesn't have anything useful to say," he said. "He had 4 hours of useful things to say," Elena said. "The territorial prosecutor received the record yesterday." She didn't know for certain that was true. Ferris had said the review was in process, but she said it with the complete steadiness of someone stating a documented fact because uncertainty was not something she could afford to show in the next 30 seconds. Cord heard something before the rest of them did. He turned his head slightly toward the road. Hooves, coming from two directions. Pete Selden came through the gate from the south road with Garvey and two hands, moving at a controlled trot that said they'd been watching for this. Morrison came in behind them. From the north fork of the road came both Hatch brothers, and with them a man Elena recognized after a moment as Delbert Kane's son, and another man she didn't know at all. They arranged themselves at the edge of the yard the way they had in the week before. Not theatrical, not aggressive, just present. 7, 8, 9 of them, against Voss's 7. But numbers weren't the point, and everyone in the yard knew it. The point was that Voss had spent 3 years building a system that depended on isolation. You take them one at a time. You make each one feel alone. You make the math too heavy for any individual to carry. And now there was no individual to isolate. There was a yard full of people who had decided to be a problem together. Cord said something quiet to Voss that Elena couldn't hear. Voss looked at the yard. He was still doing the calculation. She could see him doing it, adding up the men he had, the men across from him, the legal architecture that Ferris and Fenwick and the territorial prosecutor had already started building around him, and arriving at the conclusion that the arithmetic had changed in some fundamental way that couldn't be fixed by what he'd brought with him this morning. He looked at Elena. She looked back. "You did this," he said. It was almost conversational. "Most of it," she said. A pause. His jaw moved. "You're a hotel stagecoach widow from nowhere. You've been here 6 months. 7, she said, and you spent all 7 of them trying to use me to get to my husband, which was a mistake. I wasn't his weakness. I wasn't anybody's weakness." She'd thought about this moment, or a version of it, more than she'd admitted to herself. Not with any satisfaction exactly. She wasn't built for satisfaction that came from other people's defeat, but with a clarity about what she needed to say to make it real, to close something that had been open since a woman named Margaret Hart had put her hands on her elbow and told her she didn't belong anywhere. She wasn't interested in winning. She was interested in being done. Voss turned his horse. It wasn't a dramatic exit. It didn't have the quality of a man who'd accepted defeat with grace, because Garrett Voss was not a graceful man. It had the quality of a man who'd run his numbers and found them insufficient, and was removing himself from the situation with the deliberate composure of someone who is furious and isn't going to give you the satisfaction of seeing it. His men turned with him. Cord went last, and as he turned his horse, he glanced back at Elena once with an expression that was unreadable and then was gone. They rode out through the gate and down the road, and the dust came up gray in the morning light, and then settled, and the yard was quiet. Pete Selden let out a breath that was mostly a laugh. "Well," he said. Nobody said anything else for a moment. Then Cal appeared in the doorway behind Elena and Wyatt. She hadn't known he was there, hadn't heard him come to the door, and said, in the bewildered tone of a child who has missed the main event, "Did they leave?" "They left," Wyatt said. "Without doing anything?" "Without doing anything." Cal considered this. "That's good, right?" "That's very good," Elena said. Garrett Voss was arrested 4 days later on the road between his property and Harlan's Crossing. Deputy Marshal Ferris handled it himself, with 2 additional marshals from the territorial office, and Cord was taken the same morning at a boarding house in Caldwell Junction. Fenwick surrendered voluntarily through his attorney, which was the move of a man who'd already negotiated his cooperation and its terms. Prescott was not charged, though Webb told them later that he'd received a formal censure from the Territorial Bar Association, which was not nothing. Voss's property and financial arrangements went under territorial review. The competing land claims he'd filed against Boone Creek and the other ranches were vacated within 2 weeks, with the corrected survey records reinstated. The lease arrangement on Redtail Creek access, which Tom Calloway had handed over to Voss along with his property, was renegotiated with the new holding company under terms that restored Wyatt's water rights. Elena got all of this in pieces across several weeks through Webb's correspondence and Ferris's formal notifications and Dory Selden's considerably more colorful account of county reaction. She read each piece at the kitchen table, filed it where it belonged, and kept doing the work that needed doing, because that was the structure that had held her together through the hard months, and she saw no reason to abandon it now that things were easier. The bank sent a letter reaffirming the loan terms without the additional documentation requirements they'd requested in January. Orrin Fitch at the general store was back to his full warmth, which she accepted without comment. Mrs. Fenner, who had made the pointed remark about the law at the market, stopped Elena on the street one Thursday and said, with the slightly pained expression of someone doing something that doesn't come easily, that she was glad things had been resolved fairly. "Thank you," Elena said, without making anything difficult out of it, because she had spent enough energy on hard things, and this wasn't one worth being difficult about. The real end of it, not the legal end, which was Voss in custody, but the personal end, the one that actually settled something, came on a Saturday in late April. Wyatt had ridden to Caldwell Junction for a meeting with Webb about the final property documentation, and Elena was in the garden on the south side of the house that she'd spent March clearing of 3 seasons of neglect. Cal was helping, which meant he was doing about 40% useful labor and 60% conducting an investigation into what lived under the larger rocks and reporting his findings in real time. "There's a really big one under this one," he said, from 3 feet to her left. "A big what?" "Worm. Or maybe 2 worms that are connected. Is that a thing?" "Yes, that's a thing. Leave them alone. They're working." "What are they working on?" "The dirt. Worms work on dirt." He absorbed this. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means they make the soil better for growing things." "Huh." He looked at the worm or worms. "That's a pretty good job, actually." Eli was on the other side of the garden with the hoe, doing the work with the focused efficiency he brought to most tasks. He'd grown an inch since October, which had happened suddenly enough that his shirts were all wrong, and Elena had been letting out seams for a month. She was kneeling in the dirt with a trowel, working around the roots of what was going to be the bean row, when she heard Eli stop hoeing. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful evaluation, not the composure he wore like a second coat. Something more open than that, and more uncertain, which on Eli was more alarming than it would have been on most people. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." He set the hoe against the fence. He came and crouched down near her, which put him at her level, and he looked at his hands for a second before he looked at her. "Do you—" He stopped, started again. "When you came here, was it just because of the arrangement, the practical thing?" She looked at him steadily. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he was struggling, which cost him. She could see it costing him. "Did you stay because you had to, or because you wanted to?" The garden was quiet. Cal had gone still too, which was unusual enough that she registered it peripherally. Cal going still meant he understood something important was happening. She thought about how to answer this honestly. She owed him honesty. He'd been giving it to her in small, careful increments since October, in the barn with Agnes, and in the kitchen over the cornbread sugar argument, and in the schoolyard where he'd made someone sorry for repeating things he'd heard at his dinner table. "I stayed because I wanted to," she said. "Not right away. Right away I stayed because I needed somewhere to land. But that changed." She looked at him. "You changed it. You and Cal and your father and this place. I stopped feeling like a visitor sometime around Christmas, I think. Maybe before." Eli was quiet. Something moved across his face. "My mother," he started. "She was your mother," Elena said carefully. "That's not something I'm trying to be, Eli. I know what I am, and I know what I'm not." "I know," he said. "That's not—" He stopped again. She waited. "I just wanted to know if you were going to leave." The question landed with the full weight of what it actually was. Not a 12-year-old's curiosity, but a 12-year-old's fear. The specific fear of a child who'd lost one person and had spent 7 months deciding whether to let himself have another, whether the investment was safe enough to make. It was not a question she could answer with comfort or reassurance, because false comfort was its own kind of dishonesty. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. "I can't promise you nothing will ever happen. Life doesn't work that way, and you're old enough to know that better than most kids your age. But I'm not going anywhere because I want to go. This is my home. You're my family. That's not something I take lightly." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not the grown man nod he'd given her at the courthouse, the formal one. Something younger. Something that was still learning its own shape. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He picked up the hoe and went back to work. Cal, who had been performing stillness with the effort of a child who has a lot to say and is managing it, immediately said, "I already knew you weren't going to leave." "Did you?" Elena said. "Yeah, because of the biscuits." He said it with perfect seriousness. Someone who's going to leave doesn't argue about the biscuits that much. She laughed. It came out before she could make it smaller. A full, actual laugh. The kind she didn't produce often enough. And Cal looked pleased with himself in the particular way of a child who's made someone laugh and considers it a personal achievement. "The biscuits are important," she told him. "They really are," he agreed, and went back to his worm investigation. No. Wyatt came home in the late afternoon with the final paperwork from Webb. The clean title to the East Pasture, the restored water rights, the vacated competing claims, all of it in order and signed and finished. He sat at the kitchen table and spread it out and went through it with the careful attention of a man confirming that the thing he's holding is real. Elena put coffee on. She stood at the stove while he read. "It's done," he said finally. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him straighten the papers. 3 years, he said. "I spent 3 years managing this by myself and not making any progress. You've been here 7 months. You did the work that needed doing for 3 years, she said. I came in when the situation was ready to be resolved. That's generous. It's accurate. She brought the coffee over and sat down. You kept the ranch alive. You kept the boys alive. You kept doing the work when there was no good reason to believe it was going to get better. She looked at him directly. That's not nothing, Wyatt. That's most of it. He held her gaze. You wrote the complaint. We wrote it. Your name is on it. You wrote it, he said. And you stood on that porch twice and didn't move, and you kept a ledger that the marshal called the most organized documentation he'd received in 11 years. His voice had the flatness of someone stating facts he's been turning over for a while. I don't know how to... I'm not good at saying certain things. I know, she said. I'm working on it. I know that too. He looked at his coffee cup. I'm glad the axle broke, he said. On that particular road. I'm glad it was Harlan's Crossing. It was not a declaration. It was not the kind of thing that gets said in any particular way in books or stories. It was just a man saying a plain thing about luck and geography, except it was also everything else. 7 months of shared mornings and shared work, and a marriage that had started as a practical arrangement and had become something neither of them had fully planned for. So am I, she said. She meant it all the way down. Spring came into Boone Creek the way it comes to that country. Suddenly and with force, like something that had been waiting to happen. The garden Elena had cleared in April came up strong through May, beans and squash, and a row of herbs she'd ordered through Fitch's general store with the particular satisfaction of someone planting things they intend to be there to harvest. The ranch was not transformed. That was the thing she thought about sometimes when people in town said things about how well it was going, how much had changed. It hadn't been transformed. Transformation was a word for things that happened to other things, stories where everything became something different after the hard part was over. Boone Creek still had a fence line that needed regular maintenance. The gray mare Agnes still had opinions about which rider she preferred and made them known. The loan still had to be serviced, and the hand still had to be paid, and the market prices for beef were what they were, which was variable and occasionally infuriating. Cal still negotiated every vegetable like it was a treaty process. Eli still had the cornbread argument with Elena at least twice a month. No sugar versus sugar. No resolution in sight. Life was not different in kind. It was different in weight. That was what she'd learned in the end. Not a lesson she could have read in a book or been told by someone who'd lived through something similar, because it was the kind of thing you have to earn through the specific texture of your own particular hard time. The weight doesn't change because you win something or prove something or outlast someone who wanted to beat you. The weight changes because you stop carrying it alone. That was the thing people got wrong about survival. They thought it was about being strong enough, stubborn enough, capable enough to handle what came at you. And those things mattered. She'd needed all of them, and she'd called on all of them. But what had actually changed things was not her individual strength. It was a woman named Dory who came by with a pie and said hard things because she thought Elena should hear them from a friend. It was Pete Selden on a horse at the gate. It was old Delbert Kane riding in slow to put his name on a document. It was Eli in the schoolyard making someone sorry for repeating things that had been said at his dinner table. Nobody builds a life alone. The people who tell you they did are misremembering, or they've confused being alone with being the only one who was paying attention to what they had. Elena had spent most of her life being told, in various ways, that she was insufficient, too quiet, too plain, too poor, too easy to overlook. The Hart family had looked at her for 6 years and seen someone they couldn't use and therefore couldn't value. Garrett Voss had looked at her and seen a weak point, a tool, a thing to be leveraged. They had both been operating on information that was wrong. Not because Elena had become someone different. She was the same person who'd sat in the corner of a stagecoach trying to take up as little space as possible. She hadn't transformed. She'd just stopped agreeing with them about what she was worth. That was the difference. That was all of it. On a Thursday evening in June, after dinner was cleared and the dishes were done and the boys were somewhere outside in the long summer light, doing something that involved running and periodic loud statements about fairness, Elena sat on the porch in the chair that had become hers over the winter, by the simple process of sitting in it enough times that nobody else sat in it anymore. Wyatt came out and sat in the other chair. The ranch spread out in front of them in the evening light, gold going to amber, going to the soft gray of early dusk. The pasture was full, the animals settled. The garden was growing. The barn was solid. The porch railing that had been loose since October had been fixed in March, replaced entirely rather than patched, because Wyatt had taken it apart and determined that patching wasn't going to hold. She'd watched him do it. He'd done it methodically, without frustration, just working the problem until it was solved. She thought that was probably the most accurate thing she knew about him. "Dory says the Holloway girl is getting married in August," she said. "That right?" "She wants to know if we're coming." "I suppose we are." I told her probably yes. She watched a hawk circling over the south pasture. "Cal wants to know if he can have new boots for it. He always wants new boots. His are too small." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "I'll take him into town Saturday." She nodded. The hawk found what it was looking for and dropped out of the sky with the efficient precision of something that has spent its whole existence getting exactly this good at exactly this thing. "Eli asked me today if I was going to leave," Elena said. Wyatt turned his head to look at her. "I told him I wasn't." She watched the empty sky where the hawk had been. "I told him this was my home and you were my family." A pause. "What did he say?" "He said okay." She almost smiled. "And then Cal said he already knew because of the biscuits." Wyatt made the almost laugh that she'd learned to hear. "Cal's not wrong," he said, "about the biscuits being important." "He's really not." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her already, with that directness she'd stopped finding disconcerting in October, and had started finding somewhere around Christmas necessary, like calibration, like having a true north. "This is not the life I planned," she said, "when I was 22 and planning things." "No," he said. "Me neither." "I think it's better," she said. "What I planned wasn't very specific. This is very specific." He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said, "it is." Specific was not a romantic word. She didn't need a romantic word. Romantic words were for situations that required embellishment to sustain themselves. What she had with Wyatt Boone, what she had with this ranch, these boys, this yard, this particular loose-hinged gate that she oiled herself anew by its sound, was not embellished. It was made of actual things, work and difficulty, and a consistent showing up for what needed to be done. The kind of love that doesn't announce itself because it's too busy being present. Cal came running across the yard from the direction of the barn with the full-body commitment of a child who has been running for a while and has decided to continue running rather than walk, for reasons that appeared to be purely momentum. Eli came after him at a more dignified pace that nonetheless covered the ground quickly. "Pa," Cal called before he'd even made the porch. "Eli said I cheated at the game, but I didn't. I just found a better rule." "There isn't a better rule," Eli said, arriving at the porch steps. "There's the rule, and then there's what Cal decided the rule should be, and those aren't the same thing. The rule makes no sense, though. That's not how rules work." "Okay," Wyatt said, without raising his voice, and both boys stopped. "Whatever happened, it's done. Come inside." Cal came up the steps and went past Elena and stopped, and came back and leaned against her arm for approximately 4 seconds in the unselfconscious way of a child conducting a brief refueling before continuing on. Then he went inside. Eli came up the steps. He paused beside her chair. "The bean row is getting tall," he said. "I checked it before dinner." "Good," she said. "Another 2 weeks, maybe." He nodded. He went inside. Elena sat in the evening air for another minute. The dusk was settling in across the pasture, soft and unhurried, the sky going purple at the edges the way it did out here, where there was enough sky to actually watch it change. She thought about the stagecoach, the corner she'd pressed herself into, the carpet bag on her knees and the women who spoke to each other and around her, and the retired officer who stared out the window, and the particular silence of being invisible in a small space. She thought about the hotel room in Harlan's Crossing, the narrow mattress and the window facing the alley, and sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and no clear idea of what came next. She thought about Mabel's kitchen and a small boy with direct eyes asking her if she came on the stagecoach, and a man who'd said, because it was the natural next thing to say, that there was a good boarding house on Clement Street if the hotel was too dear. The road from there to here had not been straight. It had been broken axles and difficult paperwork, and a courtroom in February, and a yard full of riders in the gray dawn, and years of another woman's grief, and 2 boys who had their own ways of deciding whether to let you in. It had been a practical arrangement that had become something that required better words than practical. She was not who Margaret Hart had seen when she'd taken Elena by the elbow. She was not what Garrett Voss had calculated when he'd decided she was the weak point. She was not the woman the stagecoach passengers had looked through, or the one the hotel clerk had assessed with faint pity, or the one who'd sat in the corner trying to take up as little space as possible. She was Elena Boone, and she had a bean row coming in, and a porch that was hers, and a gate she knew by sound, and 2 boys who came back to her arm and came to tell her about the garden. And she had a man inside who'd given her work gloves for Christmas because he'd noticed the holes in her old ones and hadn't made it into more than it was, which was exactly the right amount. She got up from the chair. She went inside. She closed the door behind her, and the lamp was warm, and the house was full of sound. Cal already talking, Eli correcting the facts of something, Wyatt's steady voice underneath it all. Elena Hart had come to Harlan's Crossing because an axle broke. She stayed because she'd finally found the thing she hadn't known she was looking for. Not safety, not rescue, not someone to tell her she was worth something. She'd found a place where her worth was simply assumed, the way the ground assumes your weight when you stand on it, without fanfare, without ceremony, without needing to be proved again every morning. She set her coat on the hook by the door. The work gloves were there already. She ran her thumb along the stitching at the cuff. Good leather, carefully made, sized for her hands specifically. Some things, she'd learned, are declarations even when they don't sound like one. She went into her family.